Nice to see you. Thank you all for joining us tonight. Welcome to this Policy and Practice Seminar hosted by the UCL Department of Political Science and School of Public Policy. My name is Aparna Ravi. I'm a lecturer in the Department of Political Science, and I'll be your chair for today. So the title of our event today is Overseas Aid and Humanitarian and Disaster Relief. So our kind of description, humanitarian aid has long served as a vital tool to deliver relief to vulnerable communities and develop geopolitical goodwill globally. However, the future of international aid now faces unprecedented uncertainty. The dismantling of USAID, which is the US's flagship aid delivery agency, has sent shockwaves through the global aid ecosystem. And this contributes to funding cuts in the UK and has also cast doubt on the sustainability of future international assistance programs. At the same time, increasing restrictions on access to aid and the deliberate obstruction of aid in conflict zones have also threatened to deepen humanitarian suffering. So our panel of experts will explore this evolving landscape around development aid and humanitarian assistance and answer some key questions around the future of international aid. So to discuss this topic, we're really delighted to welcome three excellent speakers. So we're delighted to welcome Mozam Malik, who's the CEO of Save the Children UK. Mozam joined Save the Children as a CEO in January 2025. He has served as the UK ambassador to Indonesia for 5 years and as Director General, first at the Department for International Development, DFID, and then at the merged Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, FCDO. And then Samir Sa, who is joining us remotely. Thank you, Samir. He's Director of Programs at Medical Aid for Palestinians. He led MAP's first emergency medical technician mission into Gaza in December 2023 and has spearheaded the organization's humanitarian response efforts from the UK. Coming to MAP with a background in public and global health, he's worked in over 35 countries in Asia, Eastern Europe, Middle East, Africa, and South and Central America. In February 2025, he was honored with a humanitarian medal by His Majesty King Charles. And then we're delighted to welcome Pablo Soriano Mena, Public Policy Manager at Catholic Agency for Overseas Development. Pablo is an international policy expert, economist, and former UN diplomat with extensive experience in development finance and global governance. He's negotiated major UN resolutions on the SDGs, debt sustainability, and international development, and currently leads public policy at CAFID. His work focuses on advocacy for economic and climate justice, enhancing local voice, leadership, and the agency of vulnerable communities. So just before we get to hear from our panelists, I'll quickly discuss the format. So we'll have about 5 to 7 minutes of opening remarks from each of our panelists. And then we'll have a short sort of discussion between the four of us with a few questions and follow-ups. And then we'll open the floor to your questions. And then just a final note, so the whole session, including the Q&A, is being recorded. So this will be posted online on our department's website and YouTube channel. And just a note, if you speak, you'll be heard in the recording. And if you don't speak, you won't be heard. Great. So then without further ado, I will hand it over to Mozam. So unfortunately, we do have to use the mic, so feel free to.
That's okay. So I'm probably going to go and stand over there, if that's okay, so that I'm not trying to juggle the mic and my notes. First and foremost, thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here at UCL. For those of you who know a bit about Save the Children, you'll know that today is the Christmas jumper day. So I was going to wear my Christmas jumper, but I decided that it might be too great a distraction from this very important topic that we're discussing. So I brought it along to show you in any case. So this is what I've been wearing all day long. And you should see some of the stuff that my colleagues were wearing today. But of course, this is a big event up and down the country, and it's a big fundraiser for us. And I think by the time I left the office, we were at 1 million pounds and counting. So it's a really important bit of what Save the Children does, but actually it's kind of embedded in British culture now. I was on a call with Save the Children CEOs earlier in the day, and they were looking at my jumper and all sorts of funny jokes about the national character in Britain and so on. But anyway, let's turn to more important subjects. So I'm going to leave talking about humanitarian aid until the Q&A and follow up, because I think Samir and Pablo may cover some of that. But I'm happy to talk about humanitarian aid in general terms, and indeed in specific crises as we see playing out around the world. Instead, what I'm going to do is talk a little bit more about the wider landscape around overseas aid and international cooperation and quite where we are headed. Because where we are headed is actually a very, very difficult place. For those of you who know a bit about this area and have followed it, I've worked in this space, in and out of this space for more than 25 years. We are really in quite a unique place. The political consensus that held in the UK around international assistance, cooperation, aid has well and truly gone. That consensus held for the best part of 20 years, a cross-party consensus shared between the Conservatives, Labour, and the Liberal Democrats. It led to an act that was enshrined in law, but whilst the act is still in place, governments have started to disregard it. And in talking about that, I think it's really important to see the situation that we face today, not just as a crisis, but as an opportunity to rebuild differently. And I'll talk a bit about that. And that rebuilding can't mean trying to go back to where we were, because the world has changed. So that commitment, that cross-party consensus, that creation of DFID back in 1997, and I joined DFID within 6 months of its foundation back in May 97, reflected the time and the political context. And that context has changed. And so whilst it was an amazing thing, and it was an amazing thing that the UK led on the global stage, that world has gone. And so we can't wind the clock back. So we need to be thinking about the world into which we're headed. And I believe that that world means leaving this concept of aid behind and actually thinking about a broader concept of international cooperation that's rooted in principles like mutuality, equality, solidarity, and that's co-created with partners rather than simply offered on a voluntary basis. But turning just then to the stark situation that we're in, the UK, of course, got to 0.7 in the international aid budget, so 0.7 of global gross national income. But over the last 5 years, that has first gone from first of all, it started going down even when it was at 0.7. So in the middle of COVID, when I was still at DFID, as GNI went down, the government of the day decided that 0.7 of GNI was therefore a smaller number and started cutting the aid budget in the COVID period, which was an appalling and a shocking thing to do. But then subsequently, despite 0.7 remaining enshrined in law, we've gone to 0.5 and now to 0.3. And of course, the reality is even worse than 0.3 because the aid budget has been used to pay in-country refugee costs, as you will know, hotel bills that have been in the news a lot. And if you were to exclude those costs, then in fact, we're heading for about 0.22 of GNI in terms of UK aid going overseas by 2027. And that's the lowest level since records began in 1979. And of course, this comes at a time when we are seeing conflict escalating around the world, humanitarian needs at unprecedented levels, climate shocks on the rise. At Save the Children, we've estimated that if you compare where we're headed to where the UK government was just 5 years ago, that this translates into something like 62 million fewer people receiving bilateral assistance around the world in areas such as nutrition, family planning, education, and humanitarian support. And that's just on the bilateral budget. So if you were to look at the impact through the multilateral side, the impacts are even more severe. And the UK, of course, isn't alone. As Aparna said at the beginning, USAID under the Trump administration has been dismantled in a willfully chaotic and destructive way. Save the Children has been impacted by that, but the whole sector has been impacted by that. And just about every organization in this sector is facing at least a 20% cut in its income and resource flows. So we've had the US aid cuts, the UK aid cuts are coming and they're just beginning to bite, but Germany and other Europeans are following close behind. And my estimate is that, so ODA, Official Development Assistance, which is the official measure of aid, is an OECD definition. So it's a voluntary thing that OECD countries give and they submit data to the OECD to track what level of aid there is. And that 0.7 international target is a UN target, but really it focuses on that ODA. that's measured by the OECD. Once these aid cuts work through, our estimate is that the OECD ODA as a proportion of GNI, OECD GNI, will fall to about 0.2 to 0.25 maximum of OECD GNI. And that's a low from about 0.37 a couple of years ago. So the numbers are really very stark across the landscape for aid. And of course, behind the numbers are real people's lives. And we are seeing those real world impacts playing out in country after country. So this year I've been in Somalia, I've been in Ethiopia, I've been in Jerusalem and the West Bank. And in all of these contexts, and my colleagues have been in Afghanistan and South Sudan and elsewhere, in each and every one of these contexts, you can see the impact of these aid cuts. So for example, in Somalia, I was there in June. Save the Children has been running about 370 health facilities. Due to the US aid cuts, about a third of those 370 health facilities are closing down. That's 250,000 children who will lose access to critical healthcare, including nutrition support in a country where there's a real nutrition crisis playing out. Similarly, in Somalia, I visited another health center where we were doing some work with women and girls who have been affected by gender-based violence, sexual violence. And the work we were doing was funded by the UK government, was supporting these young women and girls with counselling, access to legal support, community outreach to help them rehabilitate their lives and to live in their communities. That project is closing. And in talking to the range of partners and colleagues and health service providers in that part of Somalia, in Baidoa, there is no other option. It's not that this closes and people are referred elsewhere. There is nowhere else for these women and girls to be referred to. And you see this in country after country. Having been in and around this business for a long time, there's often been a debate about, does aid work? And on the way up, it's often hard to see and to conclusively prove that aid works because there are all sorts of other things going on. The economy is growing, people are getting richer, all sorts of stuff is happening. But on the way down, boy, can you see it, right? Because aid cuts kill, and children and people, vulnerable people, are dying as a result of these aid cuts. So if aid cuts kill, frankly, the counterfactual must also be true. Aid can save lives and does save lives. So what do we do about it? I think in the immediate term, it's absolutely critical to use the more scarce resource for immediate needs. And that means focusing in on low-income countries and humanitarian contexts. It means focusing on children because that demographic is disproportionately affected by poverty. And of course, that impact of poverty on children is a lifelong intergenerational impact. In the choices that governments around the world are making, frankly, I haven't yet seen the evidence that they are prioritizing either the poorest or the lowest income countries or the most vulnerable at this time. And that's a key part of our advocacy work. Indeed, in Africa, as FCDO work through their cuts, even the most important countries in FCDO's kind of strategic assessment face cuts of at least 30 to 70%. Turning to the longer term, we need to remake this case and we need to win the argument for bringing people together. We need to reimagine the system. And as I said earlier, at Save the Children, we're not thinking about how does one make a case for aid or 0.7, because actually we're in a time when we've got a much bigger fight on our hands. And that fight is for the very principle of international cooperation. Aid is a facet of countries coming together and saying, we can work together to solve problems. That's all it is, right? But in the UK and in other countries, I think over the last 20 or 30 years, it went out front and became a little bit too totemic, and that focus on 0.7 became too laser-like and became vulnerable. And as a result, we lost public support. So in making the case for international cooperation, we need to go back and argue for the need for countries to come together and to solve shared problems. And the resource flow that comes from that is one facet of that international cooperation. In thinking about this, we published an essay. I published an essay in a collection with the Fabian Society in September, and we pulled out 4 elements that we think are required in trying to reimagine the system. The first is moving from doing development to them to tackling global issues together. That OECD model, that 0.7, that it's a voluntary model. Countries get to choose what they give what they like, they cut when they like. It's even at its most enlightened, it could never escape that voluntary, charitable underpinning. And that fundamentally is now lost legitimacy with our electorates here, but actually it's lost legitimacy with the global South too. They don't want charity, they want rights. And so we need to move from doing development to them to working out how do we tackle global issues that we face together. I think a second shift is moving from bilateralism to multilateralism. Bilateral aid doesn't have the staying power, the consistency, and the volume to tackle the global challenges that we face. And so we need to move to a multilateral system where resource flows are negotiated, where there's a sense of rights. And those institutions need reform, much strengthened governance, much stronger voice for the global South. But we need to move to a system that's more squarely rooted in the multilateral. Thirdly, we need to move from aid to a sense of investment and negotiated commitments so that we see this as the resource flows in this international cooperation as investments in our mutual future, so that not only are we tackling poverty in poorer countries, but we're investing in a safer world, which is important for the UK's own prosperity and security. And fourth, we need to use the most precious resource, that taxpayer-funded grant, which is ODA, appropriately. It's been misused and used in middle-income countries inappropriately over the last few decades. And we need to focus it in on those that really don't have the creditworthiness to be able to access private finance or blended finance or multilateral institutions. So we need to use that as the precious resource. Now, those 4 shifts aren't a blueprint, and that's kind of deliberate because at Save the Children, we're very clear that we can't and we shouldn't be the ones coming up with a blueprint. The solution, the reimagining the system, has to be something that we do together as an international community with partners. And so we're thinking about the shifts that are needed, but this is a conversation that needs to happen with partners around the world, particularly affected communities and vulnerable people who are on the front lines. The last thing I want to just say is that Save the Children, like a lot of people in this sector, over the last couple of decades, spent a lot of time engaging with politicians and decision makers. And that was an important thing to do. But in so doing it, we neglected the public and the underlying public support that we need to underpin international cooperation and indeed the financial flows that are needed. And so moving forward, we are thinking hard about, yes, how do we work on the policy? How do we engage with the political process? But actually, how do we engage with the public? Because fundamentally, the public need to be persuaded and to believe that this is an investment in our collective future, in their future, in the future of vulnerable children up and down our country, because a more dangerous world is bad for their future too. So we need a new narrative and we need to engage with the public. We need to find new partners in that endeavor. And this will take time. There's a lot of excitement amongst many of my peers around the UK's G20 presidency in 2027. I think that's an important opportunity, but actually this thing needs to take some time. There are various efforts underway around the world, and I can talk about some of those if that's of interest to people. But thank you. I think I probably overstayed my 7 minutes.
More than fine. Thank you so much, Mazum. And then we'll turn it over to Samir. And I think, Samir, you can just speak normally and we should be able to hear you.
Hi, everyone.
Thank you.
So I'm going to talk about Gaza and the challenges in aid delivery. And it's a very difficult and complex topic because there are so many things that are happening and changing all the time that as an organization, Medical Aid for Palestinians is doing scenario planning exercises literally every month because the scenario changes. And then we get into a situation which we have never imagined would happen. just to kind of start with where we are at the moment, you have a ceasefire or so-called ceasefire, but airstrike, shelling, gunfire outside a yellow line, which is imaginary or which is not demarcated, it's invisible. And people try to kind of access their houses, go and find whatever they could recover from their houses, and they get bombed and killed over there. And very recently, on 5th of December, there was a case where a family tried to go, and it was a husband, wife, and their child, and they tried to go on foot to their house, which is in North Gaza, in Beit Lahia area, and they were bombed. So OCHA coordinated an attempted rescue, but they were given permission after 5 hours. And after 5 hours, the permission they were given was that the civil defense team could only go on foot to the incident area. And when they arrived there, they found that the individual had already died. And they had only gone to retrieve winter clothes because it's freezing over there. If you see photographs now from Gaza, there are rains during winters. It's flooded in most of the camps. There are now 942 displacement sites hosting 1.5 million people. And most of these are makeshift or scattered sites. In Gaza, there's a place which is called Faras Market. They have a mountain of solid waste. It is now 13 meters high, and the arrival rate is that there's one truck every 3 to 5 minutes coming and dumping more garbage over there. Half of the drinking water samples do not meet standards, and recent UN they did a survey, and they said that it would take 105 trucks 7 years to clear the rubble. I went into Gaza for the first time in December 23, and I've been there again. I was there last in February, March this year. I saw the ceasefire. I saw when they broke the ceasefire. And I've worked in 7 different conflict areas. I've worked in Liberia, Sierra Leone, Sudan, Haiti, Myanmar, Lebanon, Gaza, etc. And I can tell you what I have seen in Gaza is nothing compared to any of the other places I've worked in. It has been quite something on myself as a person. I've had to undergo counseling, I've had to undergo treatment, including psychiatric medication, just to get over what I have seen over there. And I don't talk about those things because it's quite emotional for me. And at Medical Aid for Palestinians, we have been working from day one. We were actually the very first organization to respond to the emergency after October 7th, because we had this practice of having a zero stock inside Gaza. So when the bombing started, we had roughly $700,000 of medical equipment and supplies we released to all the hospitals. And since then, we have set up a program where we have a nutrition program, which is basically screening children for malnutrition, providing them with ready-to-use therapeutical food. We have a medical program, which includes medical teams that go in. We have a protection program, which does case management of people who are survivors of sexual exploitation and abuse. We have a disability program, we have a mental health program, and we have a water and sanitation program. Now, when we talk about obstruction of aid, there are different ways in which this happens. I'll start with the emergency medical teams because that was the first thing I led into Gaza. Emergency medical teams are restricted, first of all, in the medical volunteers who can go in. So when we take medical teams inside, these are literally well-qualified consultants in the NHS, at least 90% of them. There are some from other countries. These are people working in the NHS, senior consultants, surgeons, physicians, anesthetists, etc. And there's a rejection rate of 40%. So people are not allowed entry. And the worst thing is that when we go into the medical teams would go from Gaza, initially from Rafah crossing from Egypt, but later on from Gaza. And you go into Jordan and you wait over there, and you're supposed to leave next morning at like 5 or 6 in the morning, but you find out at the last minute whether you're allowed to go in or not. And that happens around between 10 to midnight. They tell you so and so doctor is not allowed to go in, so and so doctor can go in, and there's no reasons given for the rejection. When I was in Gaza during the ceasefire, we would go out to buy tomatoes. Tomatoes were $10 a kilogram. Expensive, really expensive. And then they broke the ceasefire, they started bombing. And I was on the first convoy out of Gaza after the bombing started. And by the time I left, it was $55 to a kilogram of tomatoes. And despite all this, there's a limitation on the cash that emergency medical teams can carry in, which is roughly around 300-400 pounds. I don't know the exact equivalent of the shekels there are, but you cannot carry much cash in. So you're limited and you're kind of using the supplies that are inside Gaza. Also, the supplies that you can carry yourself is limited to one large suitcase and one backpack. And that too, there are many stories which you must have heard about what they allow and they don't allow. And I'll give you a very good example, which was quite heartbreaking for me when I heard about it. The King of Jordan had graciously allowed 2,000 children with cancer and other non-communicable diseases into Jordan for treatment on the condition that they would go back to Gaza. And these children, when they came into Jordan, they were treated and then they were sent back into Gaza. And the Jordanian government gave them packets, toys, food, crayons, coloring books, etc. And when they went back, actually at the border, the Israelis took all these stuff away from children. We are talking about 5, 6, 7, 8-year-old children who were crying because their things had been taken away from them. There's then the issue of deregistration of NGOs. Muazzam just spoke before me. Save the Children is one of them. The reason for deregistration is because you speak out about the atrocities that are happening there. You call a genocide. And the Israelis claim that this is delegitimization of the Israeli state. And so they refuse entry for you. They refuse entry for your staff. They refuse entry for all the goods that you are going to supply inside Gaza. In fact, out of 14 humanitarian movements recently, which were submitted for coordination, only 7 were facilitated, 3 were kind of partially blocked, 2 were denied, and 2 were cancelled. There are multiple crossings that can be utilized, but they still remain closed. The only ones that are open with restricted access is Kesuf and Zekem, which is Erez West, and Kerem Shalom, which is towards Rafah crossing. So when we talk about a ceasefire and the aid that was allowed in, from the start of the ceasefire in October, on an average, only 100, 120 trucks have gone in. And that too, with the Israelis approving only limited health, nutrition, food, wash, and shelter items. These items can be moved by authorized organizations only. So Save the Children is not authorized. Medical aid for Palestinians is not authorized. And so we depend on UN organizations. And amongst the UN organizations also, you know that UNRWA is classified as a terror organization by the Israelis, despite the fact that they are the largest organization which run clinics, which run schools, etc., inside Gaza, inside the West Bank, and also in Lebanon, in the refugee camps. So what are the challenges in terms of aid delivery? First of all, there's lack of sufficient aid. And that is because the control is by an occupying force that refuses to accept that what they are doing is a genocide. And it's a fact. And you know, there are some organizations which don't call a genocide, but the fact is that is what is happening. You have deregistration of NGOs on the pretext of delegitimization. They label human rights NGOs and UNRWA as terror organizations. And I wouldn't be surprised at some point of time if we up our advocacy a little bit, if we talk about genocide a bit more, that they would then label us also as a terror organization. There's a lack of warehousing. There are only 3 major warehouses inside Gaza. There's a shortage of equipment. The ceasefire allowed for a specific amount of fuel to go in, but only 10% of that fuel is going in. There's looting of aid, which is very, let's say, it is very disturbing in the sense that a lot of the looting that happened, for people who know what is happening in Gaza, is in areas that were demarcated as red zones. Now, the red zone, for people who don't know, this is an area where even as an international NGO or as a UN member, if you step inside the red zones, you're going to get shot. So how can you have looting inside the red zones? It is because these are the groups that have been funded and supported by the Israelis, the armed groups. And they are the ones looting equipment. And then we see all these images on social media and in the news about people looting aid. And then even if they're looting aid, they are desperate. And then you know about the GHF, which was set up by the Americans and the Israelis, and then people trying to access it were shot at and they were killed. Then you have the truck drivers who are taking the aid in, and you have even drivers of UN convoys going from the south to the north who are detained, who are humiliated, who are arrested, interrogated before they are released. You have a dual use list. And recently, you must have read in the news that UNICEF could not take even syringes for vaccination. 1.6 million syringes were refused entry because they are kind of dual list. You cannot take tents inside. Just recently, there was an article about the British government, which who protested because their tents took like 1 year to go in. So finally, if you do have something inside Gaza, then how do you distribute it? Roads have been bombed. There are parts where you cannot even go. Fuel is in limited supply. There are limited number of vehicles. People are exhausted. People are starving. They are unable to access even centers where food or whatever is being distributed is available. The prices of commodities have gone up. And you know what? Aid is not able to go in, but the private sector is able to flourish. And that is why the prices are up. So a lot of the trucks that go in are actually from the Israeli market. So Israeli businessmen benefit from aid going into Gaza, not aid, from commodities going into Gaza on which they make a profit, 10 times the normal price, when aid trucks are being not allowed to go in. And then you have attacks on aid workers, healthcare staff. You remember the World Central Kitchen bombing at the start of it, which for me, actually, I found it kind of disturbing that the first time, that time Joe Biden as the American president, that was the first time he spoke about Gaza when he uh, basically made a statement that he was shocked on attacks on health workers. But actually, so many health workers had been killed before that. The only time he was shocked was when foreign aid workers had been killed. And then aid workers themselves. My own colleagues inside Gaza, we have over 140 staff members. They're exhausted. Their mental health is suffering. One of my colleagues, he got his family to see me when I was inside Gaza. That was in January 24. His 5-year-old son was there. I said, how is he doing? They said, well, he's all right, but every time a bomb falls, he wets his pants. And I was like, but bombs are falling all the time. He said, yeah, he's here to see you, so he's wearing trousers. At home, he doesn't put on trousers because it's difficult. Even if it's 3, 4 drops, he just can't, it's uncontrollable. He can't deal with it. I was in a shelter in Gaza, and this woman came to me. She was very happy, and she was talking to me in Arabic, and people were translating for me. They were saying that she wants to invite you for dinner today because she's celebrating the return of her son. And I'm like, is her son like, has he been arrested by the Israelis and is he being released? They said, no, it's a psychiatric case. Her son was killed. He was buried in front of her. He was 7 years old. She just can't accept it. So every day she goes around telling people that I'm going to celebrate because today my son is going to come back. And this is the situation inside Gaza. You'll be surprised. We talk about the genocide, but actually the genocide started much before October 7th.
So
Before
Samir,
October
I'm so sorry to cut you off, but we can kind of discuss this a little bit more in the Q&A, but we just want to keep kind of going with the event. So would you mind wrapping up, and then we'll definitely return to this in the Q&A.
Okay, so I'll talk about the last thing, funding issues. First of all, MAP as an organization doesn't take in principle from the American government and the British government because you're taking money from governments complicit in genocide. And we're not going to do that. So that limits us. And the second is donors have a short-term memory, including people. There's a lack of media attention inside the United Kingdom. In fact, dozens of people are killed. They are printed as dozens of people killed. In fact, individual lives don't count anymore. And that has resulted in a lack of flow of aid coming into organizations like Medical Aid for Palestinians. I'll stop over here, and I'm happy to take questions later on.
Great. Thank you so much. And thank you for your personal experience and the challenges and sharing that with us. Okay, so I'll just turn it over to Pablo and then we can open it up to Q&A. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks. So good evening. My name is Pablo. I come here on behalf of CAFOD, which is the Catholic Agency for Overseas Development. We are part of the Caritas family, so that you may be more familiar with that. We have work in 22 core programs, including Occupy Palestinian State. Yeah, Samir, you may know more about the work that my colleagues do in Palestine through our Caritas network as well. And we do have also a humanitarian branch that works specifically in the Palestinian area and also in other areas whenever there's a disaster that comes in. But mostly I'm gonna focus more on aid and financing because I think it's more important to talk about where we're heading at the moment, not to reduce any importance on what we have heard already. But I think it's also part of the conversation that we must have. So coming in from the aid cuts from the US and the UK, these are two different issues, and CAFOD is in a somewhat secure position that we do not receive a lot of funding from the FCDO, not from the US government. We do have a really good supporter base. However, the countries that we work in, our local partners, they do receive funding from these agencies. So they are the ones that are being affected by these cuts. And we published a report earlier this year on the impact of the USAID cuts on Kenya and South Sudan. And I mean, I can keep on going with numbers and so on, but I think it's more important to talk about the politics side behind all of these cuts and what can we do to address them. So one of the first things that me and my team, we did after the aid cuts is to try to assess how is it going to impact our partners and what can we do to help. And also what is needed to advocate for either in the UK or at a global stage or even within those countries so that we can work with them on the same page. So I started to map out with our 22 country programs to engage with them. Okay, how is this is going to affect you or is already affecting you, because US aid cuts abrupt and immediate, UK aid cuts not yet being implemented as we speak, and the majority of them taking place by 2027. So those are kind of like two different scenarios. In one, we're already see the impacts. In the other one, we have expected impact that we're still seeing, and that is obviously very negative, and that we're going to see unfold in the coming years. So with that, the idea is to also scope the landscape of what can we do in advocacy here in the UK. And one of the things that I noticed while I was doing this work was that I see that the conversation is kind of going into two different lanes. One of them is on how do we improve the system? People call it the future of aid. And then the other one is what can we do that is still supportive to the needs of vulnerable people in the global south, but is not tied to aid. So that is called beyond aid. I don't really like the labels, but people already associate them with this work. So I'm going to stick with them just for the purpose of this conversation. So In the case of what can we do to improve the aid system as we know it, we're very much in favor of having a more local approach, less intermediaries, more local support, joining the work supporting the work directly to local communities that are in need. That's something that, for example, CAFOD has been doing for decades. And we do see the impact of that. We do see the results of that. If you already heard me, I call them our partners because they are our partners. We work with them in a partnership level. They are not grantees. They're not beneficiaries. They are our partners. So I think that that's also a matter of seeing other people eye to eye, into seeing them as equals, not necessarily following that historical assumption that, oh, we're better than you and we're giving you money to do X and Y. So that's one thing. And then also to talk about where the aid is going, where it should be prioritized, the countries that need it the most, and where the vulnerable people are. I'm not very much of a fan because of the work that I did when I was a delegate at the UN. I'm not very much of a fan of following the OECD DAC list of countries because that list is based on GDP. And as an economist, I can tell you GDP is not necessarily the best picture on how development is to be measured. GDP doesn't tell you about the healthcare of a country. GDP doesn't tell you about the education of a country. So it's better to talk about vulnerability. And there are a lot of people living in extreme poverty, even in the so-called middle-income countries. And there are people that are not living in extreme poverty in the low-income countries. So let's talk about reaching where people need rather than sticking to labels on countries. That's another issue. And then the other solutions, the beyond aid solutions, we talk about multilateral systems reform. We talk about giving more agency and leadership to the voices of countries that are not traditionally heard. And I can say that with a lot of experience because I was a delegate representing a country from the global south at the UN. And even though on paper, we're supposed to be one country, one vote at the General Assembly, the truth is that some countries are heard more than others. So that is still part of the problem in the multilateral space. And that needs to be addressed. That doesn't cost any pennies. That's not aid. But that will give more power to countries to use their voice to change the system that needs changing. And then the other one is on the debt crisis. And CAFOD has been working really hard on this year. For us Catholics, 2025 is a Jubilee year, a year of forgiveness, a year of giving. And some of you that are old enough to remember the year 2000, that was the last time that we had a Jubilee year. There was a lot of debt pardoning that happened in that year. And with our campaign to solve the debt crisis on this year, we wanted to reach the same level. However, our aims this year were to change the system because what happened was that in 2000, yes, there was a lot of debt that was pardoned, but because the system didn't change, the same predatory system that kept countries going back to ask for more loans, then they got in debt again. So now we are actually addressing the main problem is to try to change the system. And we have been really advocating with the UK government to change UK legislation on that area because a lot of the contracts that are governed, that govern the debt agreements between countries and private creditors are under UK law. So the UK is in a very privileged position where they could solve this problem if they wanted to, and it wouldn't cost anything to the taxpayer. So that's another solution. And just to give you an example of how bad this crisis is that a lot of countries are spending more in debt repayments than they do in their own healthcare systems and education systems. aid used to plug that gap. But now with the aid being gone, the countries that have made the decision to obviously keep on paying their debts, because that's their status, that's the credit rating and so on, they don't have any other choice. Like the choice is like my healthcare or the debt. I mean, some of them are choosing debt. I mean, and then that's a fair choice. Obviously, they have to make that choice. But I mean, aid used to be something to help with that, and now it's gone. So, and there is several studies that say already that if debt repayments were kept at a certain level, they would allow these countries to have more fiscal space so that they can start reinvesting those funds into their own people. So that's why we're doing this. And then the last one that I wanted to talk about is on private capital mobilization, and how you may have also heard that the government is talking about they no longer want to be a donor, they want to be an investor. So moving from a donor to investor, what does that mean? And the idea is that the government will support, and is already doing that. There are agencies that have been working on this for several years already, support mobilization of funds from the private sector that go into countries of the global south. Now, this is a very interesting thing to do. It does have a lot of capacity to scale up support and reach out a lot of people, generate a lot of jobs, but also it's not a one-to-one replacement because this doesn't work everywhere. Like, do you think the private sector will be going in to Gaza, for example, in the next year? No, of course not. We need a different system to keep on supporting people that are going through crisis, that really need public support, not private sector support. And then what I mean by that is that, yes, it can work, but we have to think and really talk about who is this reaching and how is it reaching those people that actually need that support. When we talk about job creation, what types of jobs are being created? It's not just about a big label number on, with the support of X government, the private sector has been able to mobilize X amount of billions of pounds into that country. Okay, but what is happening with that? Like, who are the main beneficiaries? Because those agencies at the moment are being set up to chase returns rather than chasing impact in local communities. So I think that's also a big part of the conversation. So no, we're not saying don't do this. This is bad. We're saying, okay, but let's keep in mind what matters here. And it is the people that should be the ones that are benefiting from this. And then, another thing that people were talking already, and is on the public support. Yes, we have also seen that shift from being supportive, very supportive of the British public being very supportive of aid and overseas development. And now they're not doing so. We hear it from people in government saying when like the aid cuts were one of the easiest solutions they could come up with because nobody opposed it. Obviously, we disagree with that. We know that we have a lot of supporters that we engage with that definitely oppose that decision. We oppose that decision. But I think that a lot of more work can be done and should be done on bringing communities together. And that's one of the things that I have seen work really well within CAFOD is that we have our supporter base here in the UK, and we have our partners that are working in country. And just to give you an example, during COP a couple of weeks ago, we held a webinar that we held it at a church in Manchester. And we connected through WebEx or Zoom. I don't remember which one was it. We connected with our partners that were participating at COP in Belém, in Brazil. And the idea was to explain to our supporters, regular British people, churchgoers, what is that we were doing in Belém, why was that important, and more importantly, to explain the different nuances about international negotiations and why it's important to keep on advocating for addressing climate change and so on. And that builds that trust, that human connection that is now lost because the conversation about aid is now about numbers. How much of my taxes is being spent on this? How many millions or billions can you mobilize to do that? It's about people. And I think activities like that are good to bringing that back, that idea, and bringing that human connection.
Thank you so much. So I do have some questions for y'all, but just I'm cognizant that the audience might have questions, so we'll pivot to the audience and then maybe I'll loop back. So we can take questions sort of in groups of 3, if anyone would like to start. Maybe you can just say the question, I'll summarize it. And are there any questions in this group? We have one and then, yeah. Okay. All right. So we'll just go in a group of 3. So please go ahead.
Relates to that public support needs. That final part that you mentioned on setting those groups up to liaise with each other and kind of see the impact that they're having sounds like a really good approach. But what other ways do you think you could continue to bolster that public support piece? What other activities
Thank you.
Hi, yes, thank you for everything that you've shared with us. My question relates to the idea of shifting the perspective from aid and donation to investment. And I'm just curious if whether that idea of investing in the global south, then doesn't that then lead to the commodification of the global south? And where the idea of aid and donation means that nothing is owed, it's just given, there's no expectation. However, what the whole purpose of investment is to get a return on your investment. So then not only is there potentially the financial implications of owing, but also like, you know, the ideological, the philosophical idea of now the global south owes us for this, where obviously with aid, there kind of is, countries might feel that they are indebted, but if you label it as investment, you start treating it as investment, I feel that might create greater pressure. Whereas I feel that with aid, the whole purpose should be to provide the aid for then the nations to invest in themselves rather than the global north investing in them and then expecting something in return. It kind of feels almost like a recolonization, if you will, something of that akin to that. So I'm just curious to get your perspectives on that.
Great, thank you. I think we just have one question, then we'll do another round.
Yeah, so
Yeah, please go ahead.
in a world with more volatile political leaders at the moment, we've obviously seen aid funding being cut over the years. We've had more sort of black swan events such as Russia's invasion of Ukraine and COVID, which has put constraints on fiscal budgets. Do you envision this changing, particularly in the US going forward, or do you think it's going to continue on the same trajectory?
So just to recap, the first question was sort of on building public support for aid. The second question is like the implications of the shift from donor to investor that lead to a recommodification of the global south. And the third is on leader volatility and should we expect these age cuts to continue? So anyone want to start?
Sure. Thank you. So just on rebuilding public support, in the run-up to the Labour Party conference, we published that collection of essays with the Fabians. We also did some polling work with the UK public. And what was really interesting about that was that the UK public get the case for international cooperation. They get that we live in an open economy, that our future is connected to the world, and that requires collaboration and that requires investment. And so actually the UK publics, and they get that that's in the benefit, that leads to benefits for people in the global south and leads to benefits for people in the global north, including here in the UK. So what was really interesting about that polling was that it was a much, much more sophisticated understanding of this space than in fact you pick up in the political conversation, which is very, very reductive. So that's kind of really interesting. Now, how we do this with the UK public, I think is one of the things that we are looking at and going to be working on over the coming months. And particularly at Save the Children, we're very good at telling stories. And we're very good at telling stories about, a vulnerable mother in Sheffield and a vulnerable mother in Baidoa. The thing that we're thinking about and working on is how do we connect those stories so that this feels like, a shared planet, a shared space in which our futures are connected and tied together. So I don't have an answer for how to do this exactly, but this is really, really important work that we will do, and I know others are also thinking about. The volume of finance required to tackle the challenges that we face globally is vast. Right? Whether it's pandemics, whether it's climate change, whether it's addressing the impacts of conflict. And therefore, you need actually an array of financial instruments to be able to respond to the volume of needs across the global south. Grant finance has a really, really important role to play, particularly for those countries that don't have the creditworthiness to be able to go and borrow and invest wisely and then to manage their debt. And there are many who have gotten into trouble with that, as Pablo was explaining. But grant finance alone isn't going to solve the world's problems. There is no, I can't see any scenario in which taxpayers, because that's what it is, taxpayers from rich countries, not just the UK, but across the OECD and indeed beyond, but I can't see any scenario in which taxpayers will agree to fund grants of the volume required to solve the world's problems. So you need an array of instruments, and loan finance, debt finance, equity finance, which is investment finance that doesn't create debt but creates different kinds of obligations. All of these things have a role to play, particularly working through public institutions like the World Bank and the African Bank and so on. And then just on volatile political leaders, what do I expect? I expect quite a lot of volatility over the coming year. But you know, a year and a half ago, I published wrote a pamphlet with a couple of friends, somebody who used to be the cabinet secretary in the UK government, Mark Sedwill, and Tom Fletcher, who's now in the UN. And in it, we argued for, this was before the UK election, we argued for the need to remake the UK's approach to international affairs. And the reason we were making that argument was to pull out the fact that the world was changing, that power is shifting. We're living in geopolitically much more fractious times. And what we've seen this year is not a fundamental shift away from those long-term trends, but an acceleration of those trends. And so, you know, what we're seeing this year with Trump and with others is really an acceleration of those trends. And so that volatility that we were anticipating would play out over a decade, maybe 2 decades, is going to play out over perhaps 1 or 2, you know, over the next 10 years. So yeah, it's a very volatile time, but it's not just about individuals and leaders. Actually, there are underlying forces as economic and political power shifts to the east and we move into a multipolar world that's driving this.
Yeah, thanks. I agree. Yeah, and let's take it for like the first question on public support. Yeah, I think it's about telling stories, but also engaging with those stories. So yeah, I mean, you gave an example of a mother in the UK and a mother in a country in the global south. We also have similar stories. A farmer in near Brighton and a farmer in Kenya, and I mean, it works really well when you actually connect the people involved in those stories. So that's one thing, but another area is like to try to find entry points that relate with people here in the UK that also matter for international or global areas. So the biggest one that I can think of from the top of my head is climate change. Climate change in a way that people relate to it here in the UK, as in, oh, the summers are getting hotter, or the winter, it's odd this year. Well, it has always been, but the idea here is that when you relate something to people here in the UK, you can start to talk about it in a more like international way. And that's what we do with our supporters when we talk to them, is that we find specific areas in the local communities that we can relate to the challenges that people are facing in the global south, in the communities where our partners work. So that's I think that's also very, very important. And then on the commodification of the global south, as you put it. That's very interesting. And yes, obviously, like these, like financing, it's a set of different tools, and there are different tools that work for different scenarios. And grants work very well in certain scenarios. Private finance mobilization works very well in other scenarios. The issue here is replacing one with another. That's where we start to see some of the challenges that we're seeing. So by saying that we're going to replace all of the aid with private capital mobilization, that will generate obviously a lot of problems. And then it's a matter of, like I already mentioned, it's where does it go and what does it do in those countries. I was talking to some of our partners from Peru that were visiting here in the UK, and they come from a place where there is a British company that is working in that area extracting minerals, and they're dumping and polluting local water sources. And it's already being measured in the children. There are children with traces of arsenic in their blood. And I was talking to them and they were telling me they came to our local community offering development, offering jobs. What we have is poor health, kids that are obviously not going to develop very well because of that reason. And the only development, the only growth that is taking place is they saw it themselves when they went to this company's headquarters in London. So that is an issue that needs addressing. It's about where does the money go and what is it being done with that money in the global south. That's what we should be focusing, not necessarily on the number of how much money is being mobilized. And then politics and geopolitics. Yes, I mean I completely agree with you on the volatility, and it's really hard to map out. So I guess like our internal assessment is to be as agile as we can be and devise our plans for change. So we were not expecting aid cuts this year. So we had to divert a lot of our resources, internal resources, to mapping out what is that we're going to do about it. And it is obviously a shock, but I mean, when you start to plan and reach out a strategy in a way that is a little bit more flexible to more external shocks, you can somewhat navigate that, but it's still like it's really difficult in the end.
Thank you. And then Samir, did you want to comment on any of these three questions? Building public support. Thank you.
I think it's very important that we build public support in the UK. We have active advocacy program. We do a lot of messaging, but I want to kind of take the discussion in a different direction. I think it's a colonial era thought that public support and public debate in the UK is going to change anything. We have been in discussions with the British government who have expressed their helplessness in doing anything because they say the Americans are the only ones who have influence when it comes to Gaza. And this is everywhere. You see it in Ukraine also. It's not only, and it is, money is important, but money is only important in terms of humanitarian aid. In terms of resolving the issue, in terms of bringing peace about, you need to bring in other actors who have more influence. And unfortunately, the actors who have influence in the global south, countries like China, India, Brazil, the BRICS countries especially, and of course, South Africa, etc. You don't have that support. You don't have that public support in those countries. And even if you have, you don't have the governments really involved in trying to change the situation for various reasons. I mean, if you look at the war in Ukraine, the reason it has gone on and on is because the Russians are surviving, and they're surviving because they have support of the Chinese, they have the Indians, they have other countries. And kind of that is where countries like the European Union and the Americans also are kind of isolated. And now the debate has changed. And unfortunately, in the UK, we are still focused on let us get support from the British public, let us get support from the British government, and it's not going to change things. And that is a reality that we have to, at some point of time, accept and live with, but it's not there yet.
Thank you. I think we maybe have time for one more round of questions. If I can see. Okay, so 1, 2. Yeah, okay. So please go ahead.
Pablo mentioned how the money gets spent from the north to the south. There's an element of debt for siege, debt for aid and debt, that the West says, we see this money going in, but the elites are becoming richer in the south, but the poor are not getting anything from it. So we've got to work out if, there's a saying, if you teach people to grow their own food, they will be able to feed themselves forever. If you give them food, they will always become beneficiaries. They will never create anything. And then also, a lot mentioned on Gaza, but nothing mentioned on Sudan. Sudan, more than double the amount of people are being killed in the same amount of time. And there's probably over 2.5 million people suffering from no food. Nobody's called it a genocide. The genocide charge against Israel is just an extremely misappropriation of meaning. This, people have done.
Okay, sorry. Could we? So the question is.
But it's basically, if you don't look at everything evenly, people say, "Well, why?"
Okay.
And with Sudan, I think it's disgrace.
Okay, so we could maybe have a discussion about Sudan. So I think that's the question. Please go ahead.
Humanitarian aid operate in large scales, such as like in international or national organizations or by states. But I was wondering your views on individual action. So when we hear about these humanitarian crises, we feel as an individual that we would want to do something, but at the same time, with limited sources and power, we feel so powerless. So what do you think that we could be doing as an individual, and what do you want us to actually do?
Great, thank you. And then I think one over here, yeah, please go ahead.
Given the seemingly arbitrary agreed upon threshold of 0.7% GNI for aid, do you have your own proposed thresholds that governments should adopt? And how would you justify that in an age of economic individualism?
Yeah, and just one, sorry, I think we just have one more question, but go ahead, please. And the blue scarf, yeah.
What's to give resources to end the aid phase? Would you make the argument that they should, for example, me, I'm way more inclined to give to a local organisation, for example, in Sudan, the emergency rooms. So if you've got a big Save the Children or other similar agency, I wouldn't be inclined to go that way. And so my question is around, should big NGOs like Save the Children continue to have big operational arms in countries, or should they roll back and focus more on fundraising and advocacy? Are they better suited to focusing their resources on that and leaving the space for actual operation to the people who are on the ground from those countries, in those countries, whether it's medical aid, Palestine, or emergency room stuff?
Great, thank you. So I think this will be our last round, and we're a little bit cutting on time. So if we could kind of have the last round of comments fairly quickly. So yeah, I think the first question was kind of looking at different conflicts and how aid is distributed. Second is what can individuals do? Third is about kind of the threshold and where would we set that? And then the fourth is on kind of local, like these larger NGOs versus kind of smaller aid delivery providers. Anyone want to start?
Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Right, yes, on Sudan, yes, I agree completely with you. It's horrible what's happening in Sudan, and I mean, from CAFOT's perspective, we choose the countries that we operate based on our partners in the ground. So it's a matter of like, where do we have the capability to go in and act in that country? It's not whether we do not make a political decision on whether if we like the country or not, or if we like that government or not, and where we go. That doesn't really decide where we go. And the other point that you made that was also very interesting on some aid or some support reaching the richest in those countries, that is a real risk. And I have seen it myself in the country where I'm from. Through some intermediaries, the UK government was supporting the private sector in that country. And in the end, the support was going to companies that were building mansions in the global south, where homelessness and poverty is still a big issue. So it's a matter also, and we haven't really talked about it, transparency. It's really important in this area of work as well, particularly because a lot of the times, because the funds are so large, it is really hard to trace where every single penny is going. So a lot of the money is being channeled through different intermediaries, and you lose track of where it ends, and it is an actual issue that needs addressing. And then on individual actions, that's a very interesting, and I think I see it very similar to the next question on supporting local actors on the ground rather than organizations. And it is a very good question because and I see it as well with my actual friends and family. Like, we want to take action. I want to feel like I'm doing something. And I see that us as organizations, we're really good at pulling in a lot of that support through campaigns. So the way we reach out our supporters and that engage with us at church and in other spaces that we host is we do tell them that there's 3 ways to support the work that CAFA does. One is donate. The other one is to pray. Obviously, we're a Catholic organization, so that's relevant to us. And the other one is to campaign with us. So we had a big campaigning day in the summer with Parliament talking about climate change. So it's about getting engaged in those spaces as well. And then the other one on supporting large versus local organizations. The case for CAFA is that because we have this Catholic identity, we often have access to places where a lot of other organizations cannot go. Because we're being associated with the Catholic Church, and in the Global South, there are many countries where local communities are very religious, and there will be more trusting of us going in and helping those communities than there would be from any other organization, even the UN in some cases. So yes, I understand your question, but there is also still the case where there are some organizations that already have the infrastructure set up to go and support specific areas, and they have that expertise as well. So I think the idea here is to also do a little bit of more research on what those institutions do and how they partner with local people, because we definitely do a lot of partnerships with local communities in those countries that we work in, so that we can reach more people that need our support.
Don't hear from Samir.
Yeah, should we, Samir, would you like to kind of pick up on some of these questions?
Yeah, on partnering with local NGOs. I think what people sometimes don't understand is that a local NGO or a small NGO is not alone on its own. It's a part of civil society. And international NGOs actually do partner with local NGOs very closely. It's a mutually beneficial relationship because they have the connections to the community and they know many things about how things work within the community than international NGOs do. They benefit a lot from the expertise and the connections that international NGOs bring, whereas we benefit a lot from their local knowledge and expertise and experience, and the fact that they bring us closer to the communities that we work with. And most of our programs inside Gaza, in West Bank, in Lebanon, in Jordan, and now soon in Syria, is actually based on our partnerships with local organizations, small NGOs, which do excellent work within the communities that we work in. in response to Sudan, I've worked in Sudan many years ago, 2004, 2003 to be exact, and I have seen the horrors of Sudan. Whether you call it a genocide or not, I don't know. I'm not a genocide scholar. The International Association of Genocide Scholars did classify Gaza as a genocide. The American Jewish community actually came out and said it's all faulty because the Israelis took measures to prevent civilian deaths. That is after 67,000 deaths and 30,000 people under the rubble who are innocent civilians. So there's a lot of debate around genocide. In the end, I think there is now a larger understanding of what a genocide is. I won't talk more about it because I think it gets political and there are very diverse views around it. But if you sit and think about it, you will understand what it is. I think I'll stop here. I'll give a chance to Muazzam to speak about.
Yeah, we are pushing up at the end of time, but we can, talk after. But yeah, thank you, Muslim. Please.
Thank you. So I've got a few comments in reaction to things that have been raised. First of all, it's really important to know and recognize that actually there's been incredible progress on tackling poverty over the last few decades, right? So this is a conversation that's rooted in developments this year and over the last year or two and our current predicament. But actually, there's been incredible progress in improving health outcomes, educational outcomes, and tackling poverty over the last 40 years. But that progress has stalled in the post-COVID period, and then with the cuts and so on that we're seeing this year, we're in some trouble. Frankly, the trajectories are going in the wrong way. International measures on mortality for children and so on are going to. As that data comes in over the next year or two, we will see that things are going in the wrong direction. So we're in a bit of a crisis, and we need to try and turn this around. In turning it around, individual action has a really important role to play. Having spent the best part of 25 years working in the UK government, I can tell you that occasionally government and politics is ahead of the public. Actually, most of the time, the street is ahead of the government, and the government is responding to the street. And so people's individual action as they come together and demand change leads to governmental action. And that individual action can take the form of donations, of finance, of campaigning, but it has real power. Just in the budget, the UK Chancellor removed the 2-child limit in the universal benefit system. It's a measure that will take 500,000 kids out of poverty in the UK. 1 in 3 kids is growing up in poverty here in the UK. That is something that Save the Children and many others campaigned hard on for many years. And indeed, government has written to us acknowledging the influence from the Prime Minister and the Chancellor. She's hosting a reception that we've been invited to next week. They acknowledge that actually mobilizing the street and those voices created the circumstances in which they could take the action that they knew was the right action to take. So individual action is really important. On local organizations, Save the Children too works extensively with local partners, but we're an organization that's more than 100 years old. We started working in Ethiopia in the 1930s. When I was in Ethiopia, we've got 650 odd people. There are 2 international staff in there. Everybody else is Ethiopian. I don't think our operation in Ethiopia is international. It's very rooted in the communities in which we work. It works very closely with the Ethiopian government at national and regional level. Our trajectory is how do we actually put down roots, because we put down roots because children are universal and the needs of children are universal. Right? So this old aid model where you go in, you do development to them, you leave because you've done it, it's bust. Right? 1 in 3 kids is growing up in the UK in poverty. Should we be leaving the UK? Should we be giving up that fight? No. Children here need assistance. Children in the US need assistance and support. Their rights need championing. Same is true in Ethiopia, in Nepal, in Indonesia, and countries around the world. So we see our mission around children as a universal one. And our task is, yes, to work with local partners because we need collective action. We can't solve the world's problems alone, but we are on a journey to being local. And then on the point 7 being arbitrary, our assessment is that the volume of finance required to tackle challenges like pandemics, conflict, climate, etc., even once you run them through blended instruments and mobilize private capital, etc., that sliver of grant finance that sits at the bottom of it needs to be maybe 3 to 4 times that 0.2 to 0.25 of GNI that I was talking about. And that's true for not just the OECD countries, but actually all rich upper income countries, including the Gulf states and those who currently do some forms of aid, but who don't count it as such. Then can I make one last point, which is to say that we obviously can't solve the world's problems from London or Brussels or Washington. One of the things that has happened in the last couple of decades is that on the back of illegitimate conflicts and people playing fast and loose with international norms and rules, which we've seen accelerate this year, trust and legitimacy is at an all-time low and has broken down. And so even if we mobilize the UK public and rebuild support, even if we have fantastic ideas in the UK, a lack of trust means that we are not the best people to solve this problem. So we do need to invest in, collaborate with, and support voices from India and Kenya and South Africa and elsewhere and Peru and so on, because frankly, they have a stake in the future of this planet and we need to come together for that.
Thank you. Great note to end on. So thank you, everyone. Sorry, we ran a little over time, but that's all we have time for. Thank you so much to our speakers for a really excellent discussion. And I'll just, before we thank our speakers formally, just want to wrap up that this is our last policy and practice event for this term. So we will be reconvening in term 2, 2026. So we'll have an event exploring the social and political and economic roots of populism. So that'll be on January 15th at 6:15 p.m. All right. So thank you so much to our speakers and thank you for all the work you do. It's been a pleasure.